Light on the Hidden Way. Part 2, which continues 8 years after the prior letters. In passing a certain house during the past year, I have met, almost daily, its former owner. He had been a physician in good practice, and very popular socially, a welcome guest in many homes. My acquaintance with him was very slight, and feeling irritated at the frequency of these meetings, I usually showed my annoyance by hurrying by without appearing to see him. These earthbound souls have it in their power to make themselves very disagreeable if allowed a recognition, and finding this one always there, as much a part of the place as the trees or fence, I began to make detours to avoid the neighborhood. But this zigzag wandering between two direct points was often so inconvenient that from time to time I would venture again on my old direct course, only to find my coming watched for, as before. I mentioned these encounters to M, in one of our casual talks, as an instance of unpleasant shadowing, but knowing him to have been here exceedingly courteous, she felt he was incapable of intentionally giving annoyance, and urged my speaking. Thus has come into my life a new experience, perhaps the beginning of a work among these mistaught and erring ones. He told me he had known all along that I had seen him, but would not intrude himself upon me, much as he had hoped to win my interest and sympathy. He was lonely and miserable. Yes, he had companionship, but did not care for it. He liked better to roam about his old home and live in his old associations, though it pained him that his wife thought of him as happy in a far-off heaven, and that he could not make her feel his presence. I urged him to leave the earth atmosphere and rise into a higher life, where the stimulus of work is even more urgent than here, but he replied that he could not see what there was for a doctor to do where there were no frail bodies to wear out. He was very much disappointed to find a continued existence so unlike his anticipations, but supposed he must wait for the judgment day to know whether he was among the lost or the saved. He had always attended church when he could, both from habit and because it was the proper thing to do, but had never thought seriously of religious matters, preferring society and the good things of earth, of which he had an abundance. Nevertheless, he had died confessing his faith in the Redeemer. Now things seemed to be turned upside down. Those he had thought unbelievers are so radiant with spiritual light that he cannot endure their presence, while many good church members are quite the opposite. Then he referred again to the day of judgment, which he seemed to think would adjust matters. I do not think I made any impression upon him in this interview, but we continued our daily visits, and tried to make him understand how all days are judgment days, that by his own admission he had lived for the physical life alone, and the dwarfing of his spiritual nature is his present judgment, that we are saved by holy lives, not by a vicarious atonement, and that Christ and his true disciples, the Christ-like, are living and working to increase the kingdom of righteousness. And that though he could no longer heal the sick bodies, he could work to save souls. But this idea offended him. He was not intended to be a minister, and I could not make him feel that in the sense of helping, we are all meant to be ministers. He never walked beyond the limits of his own grounds, which, however, were quite extensive, yet seemed each day more eager to see us. One Sunday morning we tried to persuade him to accompany us to church, but without avail. Returning, I expressed our disappointment that he had not gone with us, as the sermon and music might both have been a help to him, then proposed his joining us at our evening reading at home. Perhaps too he would like the hymns we are fond of singing. This he would not promise, though I thought I saw a little yielding in his manner, and was not surprised when, later, he came gloomily into the room and took a seat beside me. We gave him no special welcome or notice, but continued the singing, apparently regardless of his presence, for he was evidently much depressed. Before leaving, he thanked me with emotion for the privilege of the evening, adding,
"I thought I did not like hymns or sermons, but I find I am just beginning to understand what is meant by spiritual food."
The next afternoon he came some distance beyond his place to meet us. I tried to induce him not to go back there, but he would not promise this, although he asked permission to be present again at the reading. Expecting him the following evening, we selected carefully what seemed to us best suited to his mood and need, closing with Whittier's answer. He spoke but little, was evidently deeply stirred, and seemed to have taken some strong, silent resolve. We did not see him the next day, nor the next, but the evening after, as we began the reading, he came among us, and then I knew his determination had been to spare me, if possible, a knowledge of the keen suffering he was enduring. My father has since told me that it requires great force of will to leave the Earth atmosphere, so strong is the clinging to places and associations, and the presence of bright spiritual beings is to these lower ones an almost intolerable pain. The soil and stain of sensual life lies all uncovered in the clear light of the heavenly atmosphere, and it is only through the cleansing touch of this purifying flame that the gathered dross may be consumed, and the spirit regain its paradise. A free sanctity of will remains always and inviolably ours. Help and forgiveness are heaven's free gifts, but no force divine can love compel, and step by step we fall or rise, as we will. But our friend was now roused and thoroughly in earnest. He came to us every night, and after a while, for half an hour in the morning. The memory of his past life became more painful to him as he advanced upward, constant in seeking the purifying flame, and so brave and silent about the suffering. Then there came a Sunday when I was told to be early in my place at church. I found a service, already begun, in that spiritual temple so often unveiled to my sight. At the close of the discourse there was a pause, and he who had finished speaking stood in the chancel, as if waiting, while the congregation remained kneeling with bowed heads. Presently our doctor came reverently down the aisle and kneeled before this radiant spirit, who, placing his hands upon the bowed head, looked upward with an indescribable expression of strength and peace. Overcome with emotion, for some moments I was conscious only of the deep silence and of an unusual intensity of white light. Then I heard the exquisite chanting of that heavenly choir, and raising my head, saw our doctor rise, clothed in his new robe of righteousness, his face so full of peace and victory that I was filled with unspeakable awe. One morning, while busy in my room, a friend from the hither side asked if he might bring his wife to me. He hoped that I might help her. Having been a hypochondriac for years before her death, she cannot now be persuaded that she is not ill, and clings so to earth that her friends are unable to influence her. Of course I assented, and a little later he brought her, leaving us alone together. She had a weary, discontented face, and the air of one who considered herself injured. I made various unsuccessful attempts to draw her into conversation, receiving only short, cold answers, until the happy thought occurred to me to inquire about her health. It was surprising how she gradually warmed, confiding to me all her ills, and how unjust and unsympathetic she had found her friends there, who wished to persuade her that since quitting the body she was no longer ill. They did not know what it was to be an invalid, and she must cease to expect sympathy. Indeed, she and they seemed to have nothing now in common, and she complained bitterly of loneliness. Oh, if she were only back again in the earth life with her daughter, who had devoted time and strength to her for years. Why had she been so imprudent? She had driven out insufficiently clad, and pneumonia had been the result. I reminded her that her daughter, having spent her youth and strength in devotion to her, needed relief and rest, and hoped that she would soon entirely recover, to be a companion for her husband and bright and well to receive their daughter when she should join them. She did not give much heed to me, but sighed and looked bored. She was evidently not to be easily moved. The next day I was surprised to see her again, and proposed that she should rest upon my bed. This appeared to please her, and she remained all the afternoon, while I went on with my work, leaving her several times to go downstairs. I was half amused and much perplexed over this new charge. I dared not offer to read, as I feared nothing more serious than a light novel would be acceptable, nor did I talk much, but tried to make her feel welcome. The following day she came again, and appeared quite peevish and woebegone. I was reading aloud, and after a little went on with it. Restless and listless, she soon went away, yet has continued her visits every day since. She seems to like our doctor, and I believe he will help divert her mind from herself. Her curiosity and interest are apparently excited, although she has no sympathy in our pursuits. Is it not sad? And yet, were she alive, what a singular expression, finding her so utterly uninteresting and tiresome, I should avoid her as much as possible. Since this experience, I have questioned whether we are right to seek only congenial society. If our sincere desire be to advance the kingdom of righteousness upon the earth, ought we not to give ourselves more freely, to share the culture and refinements that have graced our lives with those less fortunate, and above all, to exert all the influence in our power to win the shallow and selfish to a higher plane of living? My conscience reproaches me that I feel the claim of this weak, selfish, undeveloped woman, as I should not had she been an earthly acquaintance. Last summer, we passed the day with a friend in her old family homestead, and being left alone in the chamber where I had laid my wraps, I sat down in the open window, grateful for a little rest. Dreamily enjoying the peace and beauty of the outlook, I was roused from my reverie by a deep sigh, soon another, and then another, followed, finally, by most passionate sobs. I arose and looked about me, and going to an opposite door, opened it, only to find an adjoining vacant room. I returned to my seat, and distressed by the continued sobbing, was glad to be released from this haunted chamber by the call of my friend a few minutes later. Returning to the quiet of our home that evening, I asked the meaning of what I had heard, and was told that a brother of our hostess had wished to reach me, but had been completely overcome by the associations of the place. A few days later he came and gave me the sad story of his life, which is not an uncommon one, I fear. He was the eldest son of a man of rare integrity and purity of character, but of a reserved temperament, much absorbed in his books and profession, and himself so far above the lower temptations of the flesh that this kind of danger to his children did not occur to him. This son was a handsome fellow, genial, warm-hearted, and susceptible to influence either good or evil. His companions and surroundings were in many ways unfortunate, until gradually he was drawn into the toils of a fascinating, unprincipled married woman. Oh, the shame of it, that such women are allowed to poison society. Later he went to the West, and there, already demoralized, sank still lower, till death suddenly swept him away. And where? Into hell? Yes, but why? What had he in common with pure spiritual souls? That great gulf, the consciousness of sin and unworthiness, had separated him from his parents, who had died some time before, and made him shrink away and hide himself in the companionship of his equals, stifling his conscience in low pleasures. I cannot tell you what a shock and disappointment it has been to me to find that it is possible to continue a low, depraved life in the world of spirit. I had always thought that the power to sin ended here, but have learned that freedom of choice between good and evil remains as much a law of that life as this, and that there is nothing whatever in death to change a sinner into a saint, except as it brings the sternest judgment, by forcing upon the unclothed soul the exact consciousness of its condition. To the earnest, this is all that is needed to rouse a most ardent desire for the higher life, while to the pure and holy it reveals, to their surprise and joy, the heights they have attained, while, filled with that peace which passeth understanding, they behold the white peaks yet to be attained, rising all fair and glorified in the bright light of heaven. But though the sinner may descend lower and lower, the saving love is seeking him, and he can find no peace, no escape from that awful conscience which nothing will pacify. No pleasure satisfies, as ever onward he pursues the phantom, till, sated and weary, starving and humble, he comes to himself and bewails the inheritance he has wasted. But oh, how piteous is the return! Step by step, through struggle and atonement, until the lost measure of purity and strength be regained. I talked with this prodigal a long time, and urged his coming regularly, that we might help and encourage him as we do others, but when I spoke of his parents, it was pitiful to see his shrinking from them and all the sainted ones. How shall I describe to you our anxiety and suffering for him, poor fellow, during the succeeding months of repeated trial and backsliding, while his father and mother directed my efforts and helped sustain my fainting hope. Once, when we thought he had gained a sure hold and was safe, the old dull look of discontent returned, and for days I did not see him. Then our doctor begged that he might go in search of him and used all his persuasion to bring him back. I was deeply touched, for I felt that he knew that to go into those dark depths was to put himself in the way of old influences and temptations, literally plunging himself into the fire to save another. He left us, saying in his quiet way, without a word of either fear or assurance,
I must go, and if I do not return tonight, you will know why. I only ask that your thought and prayer may go with me.
He returned, looking worn and sad. His effort had been in vain. He soon left us, and when he came again the next day, I saw that he was lifted and strengthened, ready to try once more. He was gone several days. How anxious they were to us! and this time was successful. One evening, after we had finished reading and were alone, a lovely little girl stood at my knee and most pathetically besought me to find her mama. I learned that the child had never known earth life, and that her mother, now dead, was separated from her by a gulf of darkness. Why, she knew not, but had been told that I could help her. I assured her of my hope and desire to bring them together, and she left me with all a child's joy of anticipation. In the night I was roused by a touch, and saw kneeling by my bedside a young, slight, delicate woman, clad in black and sobbing piteously. I tried to put my hand upon her head, but she shrank away and cowered all in a heap upon the floor, while little by little she poured out her sad confession. Betrayed by her lover, more sinned against than sinning, in her alarm and despair she had destroyed the life of her child, and soon after faded away in a quick decline. She had been brought up under the strictest orthodox teachings, and believed herself hopelessly lost. Hence the hold he continued to exercise over her when she found him already there before her, through his own reckless act, both doomed, as she thought, and forever shut apart from the pure and good. It would be impossible to portray in words the intensity of feeling shown by these poor sufferers, their own sense of guilt and degradation, the iron door that shuts them out. Fortunate it was that I had known something of the man who had wrecked her life. She was not his only victim, though it was difficult to persuade her of this, for the fascination had been complete, and yet I felt that it loosened his hold upon her. I said all that I could at that time, and now for many months she has spent hours daily in my room. But my hand trembles and my eyes fill when I recall the dark valley we have traveled together, of which I can give you little idea. Poor little thing, my heart went out to her as it has to none other. She was so prostrate and blinded by her sense of guilt, and so drawn by habit of thought and discouragement back to the old life. Many a time she fled from him and from herself to my side, and more than once he followed, pleading or taunting, as his mood might be. Once when in despair for her my soul cried out for help, a quick flash of intense light was the immediate response, from which he fled with a yell like a maniac. After a while she came to stay most of the time in my room. She was soul sick, poor child, and lay upon my lounge both day and night, though I often woke to find her kneeling by my bedside. We talked and read a great deal to her, till gradually she came to trust that she could be saved and forgiven, and finally to realize that she still had the power to seek the light which purifies, invigorates, and strengthens. If hellfire means anything, and we are told that every old dogma contains a kernel of truth, it is this light which purifies as by fire, but which becomes their source of peace and refreshment when cleansed and healed. Once roused to the full sense of her need, the heroism displayed by our little Lou was sublime. There was no more wavering or flinching, but a patient, resolute determination to regain her lost purity and peace, nor would her conscience be satisfied with less than her utmost endurance. I remember, one day, starting to throw a little white shawl over her black robe, and how she shrank from it, begging me not to put anything white near her. How pleased I was when, long after, she let me spread it over her as she lay on my bed, looking so calm and spent that I wondered how this could be with one set free from the body. But I understand now that the spirit faints and is weary, and have been led to question whether the spirit does not react upon the body here, even more than the body upon the spirit. And then there came a night when she was brought, like one dead, by two shining ones. She did not leave us again for several days, but lay quiet and peaceful upon my lounge, under the little white shawl, with some sprays of sweet white honeysuckle beside her. Upon waking in the morning we found her gone. We knew that this ordeal through which she was passing could not kill and would not last forever, but oh, how deeply was our sympathy stirred. How interminable seemed those hours. The next afternoon we were told to be in church at sunset. We found the place filled, the altar exquisitely decked with delicate white flowers, the music enchanting, and the long, deep hush of the worshippers only broken by the soft, low strains. While I listened, awed and breathless, our little charge was borne down the aisle, all spent and unconscious, to the chancel, where one, oh, so bright and beautiful, waited. He placed his hands tenderly upon her brow, and looking up, seemed to bring down, as in answer, a flood of light ineffable. Every head bowed. After a prolonged silence, some lovely words were chanted by the congregation. Raising my head, I beheld our little Lou standing erect, her face filled with conscious peace. The little black dress had given place to a robe of pale blue light, and folded in her arms was her little girl, the child she thought she had lost forever. At first I wondered that this should not have been a sacredly private hour, but then I recalled how there is joy in heaven over every sinner that repenteth, and felt that each soul in that congregation was there from sympathy and joy. That evening, when my little flock gathered about me, little Lou asked me to read the parable of the prodigal son. I think it had a deeper meaning to us all, as we saw the emotion with which she listened to the story of the son's welcome home to the father's heart and love. During those months of anxiety over our little Lou, the young man of whom I told you in a previous letter came to me irregularly. Dissatisfied and restless in his old life, yet too weak from long habits of self-indulgence for any continued striving, my time and strength became so overtaxed by his demands upon my sympathy that he was forbidden by my helpers to come to me any more till thoroughly in earnest. This deprivation proved the needed stimulus to his first sincere effort at improvement, for he was a loving fellow, and felt deeply the separation from me and his companions, two of whom had been friends of his boyhood, and were holding to the right more steadfastly than he. Many days passed before he was allowed to see me, and then I read and talked with him alone, until, after months of slow progress, he was allowed to resume his old place at the readings, and, inspired by little Lou's example, is now one of my safe ones, happy in his awakened sensibility to righteousness, and rejoicing in the loving approval of the father and mother he had so deeply grieved. The dawn of some interest beyond her own selfish broodings also came to my invalid through watching our labor of love over little Lou. My weak ones have always shown a tender sympathy for one another. The slipping back of one is grief to all, while earnest indeed is the joy and pride of each over a brother's hard-won victory. So the unconscious heroism of little Lou stimulated all to greater effort, and won even my invalid from her listless indifference.
"You are queer women,"
she one day said to me.
"Do you really like this work? And is it not a sacrifice to give up society and devote yourselves to such as these?"
She has little spirituality, and her progress will be much slower than that of some who have sunk to greater depths. You ask me to tell you more of my little flock. Many of them have been men of prominence here. That the first shall be last and the last first, according to the world's standard of wisdom and greatness, is daily illustrated by the humility with which these men of once high places come to learn of spiritual things like little children. Their characters are various, and through devious ways have they come to that last born, but each separate experience is intensely interesting. I will try to give you fragmentary touches of a few of them. Dead here to all spiritual life and growth, they have entered the higher life totally unfit for the companionship of the blessed, and in their despair, gloom, and guilt, shrink away from all helpful influences, for only with the soul's cry of Abba, Father, does growth begin. It has been difficult to understand why this work among the soul-sick and unhappy is given me, when the better land is so full of earnest helpers, whose natural and chosen labor would seem to be just here. But we learn that it is less painful for the unspiritual dead to approach one still veiled by this mortal vestment while their sympathies and regrets hold them to earth, but once receptive to wiser teachers, they pass immediately from my guidance into the safe fold. One who has held my warmest sympathy was here a clergyman, a man of brilliant mind and natural liberal tendencies, but rejecting the higher light, preached dogmas he no longer believed, closing his eyes and understanding to truths inconvenient to accept. His suffering is twofold, the injury to his own spirit, and a grief yet more intolerable over those misled by his teaching, for he had many enthusiastic admirers, to whom his word and opinion were law. Two were gentlemen of ample means who lived moral, but narrow, selfish lives, and died leaving their property to public institutions already richly endowed. What would they not give now to be able to relieve the distress of relatives and friends who are suffering from this selfish indifference to their needs? They cannot detach themselves from these lives, following them through anxieties and hardships their care might have averted, so unreconciled at being helpless to aid them, and having only themselves to blame. In some ways these are the most miserable of all who come to me, held back from progress by regrets and remorse, they will not seek for themselves brighter spheres while those they have neglected are toil-worn here. If people could only know in making their wills what a scourge they may be preparing for themselves, which will one day drive them literally into a hell of regret and unrest, then would charity indeed begin at home and in the community where they have lived, and much misery here and hereafter be spared. Large bequests to public charities will not absolve the soul from a neglect of the modest but pressing needs of those close about him, whom public charities cannot and should not reach, but who struggle bravely and uncomplainingly, doing all in their power to help themselves. Our wealth, talents, time, culture, and refinements are sacred trusts. The ideal life demands that we give, even as we have received, not from a sense of duty, but as a gracious privilege. Nor will the soul be satisfied with any compromise, it must share its every gift. The purse without sympathy in time and trouble, it may be, is as empty, so far as it has power to grace the giver, while the man who proffers friendship and sympathy yet does not out of his abundance make that professed interest a substantial help, defrauds his own soul. Judge C. was a man of fine intellect and large hospitality, living upon a handsome estate, lord of the domain, and much deferred to in the management of state affairs. His wife had been an Episcopalian, and his children grew up with a preference for that church. He was not a churchgoer himself, loved argument, talked remarkably well, and was always ready for a discussion. Thus slipped along in ease and prosperity a life of 60-odd years, when health began to fail, and the problem of a future life presented itself. His country home was somewhat isolated, and loving intelligent companionship, he invited the Catholic priest, when in that neighborhood, to stay at his house. Religious discussions naturally became frequent and more interesting, with decreasing bodily strength, and a few weeks before his death he was baptized by the friendly priest, absolved from his sins, and persuaded that an acceptance of the Church's conditions of salvation would be a sure passport into happiness and heaven. He had been years in the spirit world when brought to me by a dear friend, who had been one of his near ones in earth life. But oh, the bitter disappointment of this poor soul! He had found a new life, but one utterly unlike that pictured to him by the priest. The teaching of religion was all false, he said, there was no such thing as vicarious atonement, and he did not believe there was a Jesus. Another was an atheist, a man of large culture, but a reserved, unsympathetic nature, who had thought to solve all life's mysteries by intellectual processes. He was brought to me shrouded in indifference and gloom, himself his own dark jail, and for months seemed hardly interested in our readings. I wondered, as I watched him pace the floor on the opposite side of the room, so coldly silent, what attracted him to our gatherings. The awakening seemed to come to him during the reading of Dr. James Freeman Clarke's Apostle Paul, and through the last pages of the legend of Thomas Didymus he sat with his head bowed in his hands, deeply stirred. The seed was quickened. He had been a man of energy and great strength of will, and once roused to a consciousness of guilt, the swift tide of remorse was terrible to see. A faithless, thankless soul, all his life impervious to the sweet influences of spirit, and finally hurried on his path of recklessness by the fearful crime of self-destruction. Do you remember the last half of Whittier's answer? It would seem to have been written for these belated ones, and expresses the truth so perfectly that their condition is no arbitrary doom, but the inevitable retribution of a life of sense and unfaith. Nothing that I have read has been more stirring to them than this poem. Though God be good and free be heaven, no force divine can love compel. And though the song of sins forgiven may sound through lowest hell, the sweet persuasion of his voice respects thy sanctity of will. He giveth day, thou hast thy choice to walk in darkness still, as one who, turning from the light, watches his own grey shadow fall, doubting upon his path of night. If there be day at all, no word of doom may shut thee out. No wind of wrath may downward whirl. No swords of fire keep watch about the open gates of pearl, a tenderer light than moon or sun, than song of earth a sweeter hymn, may shine and sound forever on. And thou be deaf and dim, forever round the mercy seat. The guiding lights of love shall burn. But what if, habit bound to thy feet, shall lack the will to turn? What if thine eye refuse to see? Thine ear of heaven's free welcome fail? And thou a willing captive be? Thyself thy own dark jail? O doom beyond the saddest guess! As the long years of God unroll, to make thy dreary selfishness the prison of a soul, to doubt the love that fain would break the fetters from thy self-bound limb, and dream that God can thee forsake, as thou forsakest him. Perhaps the most trying of all whom I have sought to aid is one who here was a man of position and influence both in his church and community, a prominent member of various missionary and tract societies, given to cant, long prayers and graces, strict in his family discipline, rigidly observing every letter of evangelical religion. He was known to be a shrewd businessman, and in consequence of his wide and well-known connection with religious and charitable institutions, became guardian and trustee for many orphans and widows, whom he defrauded of their property, using their means to pursue his growing passion for speculation. It would be most painful to you, as well as to me, to go into the details of the moral and spiritual degradation of this man, who hid his iniquity under the cloak of righteousness, imposing upon the true and simple by his sanctimonious air and loud professions. He was brought to me by one whom he had wronged, and we have done all in our power to help him, but it has seemed an almost hopeless task to restore to him even a small measure of spiritual life, for there is not a single means of comfort or inspiration to others that does not contain a bitter sting for him. The simplest word of prayer wrings from him a cry of agony. He who prayed so fluently in the prison and reformatory, who was always ready to lead the prayer meeting or offer the long grace, unable to lisp even the publican's prayer. He comes with the others, but remains apart, bowed with humility and remorse, unwilling so much as to raise his eyes unto heaven, or even ask that his darkened soul may receive. I think if there be an unpardonable sin, it is religious insincerity, which seems nearer moral and spiritual death than anything I have seen. A silent sympathy is almost all that I can give to comfort him, together with the assurance that if he will be patient and long-suffering with himself, enduring the healing pain, there shall gradually be restored to him the power to seek forgiveness and the quickening, saving love, in sincerity and truth. For yet doth he devise means that his banished ones be not expelled from him. The faith in a personal devil and his agents of wickedness was to us a far safer belief than the careless assurance we have grown into, that thoughts and actions are merely the expression of our own uninfluenced individuality. If we remember the number of undeveloped, evil-minded, and malicious souls passing constantly from our midst into the beyond, what more natural field presents itself for the exercise of their wicked propensities than the injury of those here on a higher plane than themselves, and towards whom they seem to feel a peculiar hatred and jealousy? We may be sure that the exact condition of our inner life and spiritual atmosphere is as clear to their vision as our physical forms to our material senses, and that tendencies and moods are open avenues for the influence of these subtle workers to crowd in upon, and by their artful management of vacillating motives ofttimes to turn the wavering balance on the side of wrong and evil. How necessary, then, to keep the mind clear and the heart pure, that good angels may come in and help us to battle out every struggle for right. Presences, good and evil, are ever watching near us. It is for ourselves to determine which shall be the chosen guests of our inner sanctuary. I attended very recently the funeral of a young girl, an idolized, only child. She was one of my Sunday school class, and my favorite among them all, so earnest, and always eager for the best thoughts we could glean for the week's lesson. Her illness had been sudden and sharp, one of those quick snatchings out of the home life of its very joy and center. Bereft, and stricken to the very soul, her parents could not be comforted, for their child was not. The materialistic drift of the father's mind robbed the poor mother of what consolation might have come to her through belief in her darling's gain. But this faith all unstayed, the great hereafter only a problematical preacher's tale, hope and trust had no place beside the living reality of crushing sorrow, an instance only too common of the unfaith with which the beloved of many homes are laid away. Could these mourners but detach themselves from the sway of the physical sense, their spirits, touched to finer issues, would find the vivid realities of the spirit realm an unfailing source of inspiration and strength. Can you imagine a more heartrending position than to be in one's own familiar home and place, unseen, unheard, and unfelt, thrust out, as it were, from the love that has nurtured and blessed us all our lives? So it was with this poor child. She looked about upon the objects of her daily care like one in a troubled dream. There were the plants she had so recently tended, the little singing bird in the window, the darkened house, her agonized parents, so unconscious of her presence, and then, completely overcome by the hopelessness of comforting them, who thought of her as gone to some distant place, she clung sobbing to her mother in an agony of grief and homesickness. Presently the service for the dead began, and my little friend grew more calm, as sentence after sentence of conviction and hope fell from the lips of our beloved pastor, and at the last allowed herself to be led tenderly away by loving spirits. Soon after, she came to me in my room and begged me to comfort her mother, to tell her that she lived and loved her in the old close way, but could not be happy while she and her father were so sad and unreconciled to her going, that she would like to have stayed with them longer, but was yet with them in thought, love, and often presence, and after so short a time they would have a happier home together in the brighter world. It is always a pleasant thought to me that you hold such an earnest interest in my gift. Yes, it continues with, if possible, more interest than ever, and as my patients, as you call them, cease to need my help, and pass up into the higher life, they continue to hold their affection for me and to lend a hand in this labor of love. But let me begin by answering the questions in your last letter. You ask, has this double life, as it were, been a help to you, or an added strain? It has indeed been no easy path to climb, thus doubly responsible to those dependent upon me both here and there. If I have sometimes, when discouraged, felt my radiant teachers stern in their exactions, it has been because they would not allow me to rest with less than my best effort. With deep humility and gratitude would I confess their tender patience, always so strong to uplift, comfort, and encourage. They alone know the battles lost or won, and whether at the last I shall be found worthy of so grave a trust and their sustaining help in every hour of need. What have I found the most impressive fact, aside from the essential spirituality of that life? It were difficult to select. Perhaps that perfect order of the universe which causes every soul to find its own level and exact place, by the same unfailing law that builds the marvelous architecture of snow crystal and flower, and provides for the progress of each soul as surely as for the sweep of the planets on their mighty course. We are just beginning to read in the lessons of nature and history that providential order which we call law. We have learned much of the conserving power of nature, but it remains for the future life to reveal to us that nothing is lost, and that all our toil, study, and self-discipline have been storing the soul with material which, when freed from the fetters of earth, in that life of larger opportunities, will unfold to blessed use. What joy to find what we thought lost in our weary struggle with life saved for us, stored safely away for future use. He lends not, but gives to the end, as he loves to the end. If it seem that he draws back a gift, comprehend 'tis to add to it rather, or keep, as a mother may toys, too costly, though given by herself, till the room shall be stiller from noise, and the children more fit for such joys, kept over their heads on the shelf. I wish I might say to all mothers who sit with empty arms and aching hearts, that though for a time they may not watch the growth and unfolding of their little ones, yet does their present sorrow enfold unspeakable future joy. When they come to know how their children have been cared for, and led by wise and loving friends into greater possibilities of growth than we can imagine, I am sure the compensations will overpay the heartache of this temporary separation. And to lives that have here been full of high, pure aspirations, but hedged in by cruel circumstances, what a release does death bring, opening brighter realities than their deepest longings and fairest visions have ever pictured. Most impressive to the finite mind are also the subtle, far-reaching effects of seemingly small events. The more we realize the perfect order and beneficent purpose of the universe, the more solemn becomes our sense of responsibility, and as reverence deepens into awe we confess, with the psalmist of old, Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, it is high, I cannot attain unto it. What do they do, these bright ones? I think all that we may know of that higher life is summed up in the teaching of Jesus, probably all that we can understand of it, certainly all that we need to know. First, be ye perfect, and out of that comes the service of the strong to the feeble. Whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Primarily, it is a life of growth and service. Do you ask if, then, we have already sufficient knowledge of the conditions of a future life? What value has this spiritual intercourse? First, I answer, we all want to believe in the future life. Does not every added assurance make it appear more probable? If in the providence of God and the development of man we have reached a point where, to certain temperaments at least, the veil between is taken away, may we not hope that it is perhaps a steadily growing possibility, yet to become an established fact? If I could learn all I might wish of that life, if I could answer any question that I long to know, predict the future, and solve problems through spirit agency, I should be unable to believe that this experience has any grounds for faith. It would so destroy my reverence and the sense of infinite progress. But what I have been allowed to know seems to be in harmony with the highest, purest revelations of truth which have come to us through the intuition of the great thinkers and seers of all time. As the world in the fullness of time has received new dispensations, I believe that, more and more as we are able to receive it, we shall have continued testimony of the life to come, which shall stimulate our spiritual growth and increase our reverence and humility, emphasizing the truth, except ye become as little children ye shall in no wise enter therein. Is it not something to know that our loved ones are living, that if they were true and good, they have their reward in the companionship of radiant souls and in the joys of the higher life, that having here built up the kingdom of heaven within them, they awoke at home? And how sweetly solemn is the thought that for the fallen and sin-sick there is such saving power. Again you ask, what particular sect seems to be the church? You will forgive my involuntary smile, though I do not wonder at your question. Verily, I have not received the faintest indication of any sect there. The shining ones have gathered, from all nations and religions, the pure and saintly of the ages, who have feared God, loved their brother, and worked righteousness. The condition there depends solely upon progress in the spiritual life, without any reference to the helps which have been used. I have been sitting on the rocks this afternoon, listening to the stirring harmonies of the ocean and watching the heavy bark laboriously tacking against an adverse wind, the steamer plying its steady way, or the luxurious yacht, so slight of build, bending under its overplus of sail. It seemed most fitting that the ocean should have ever symbolized the sea of life, the promised land stretching away in the unseen distance, the sea, in its interchange of calm and storm, alike to all. The yacht, like the gay life of pleasure and sensuality, may founder, or reach its destination battered and dismantled. The slow and ponderous bark, like the conservative mind with its unwieldy dogmas and long cables of superstition, plodding laboriously against the free winds of providence that do not blow out of the past. Others, like the steamer, draw a spiritual force from the conserved energies of the ages, using her sails as helps when they can speed her on her way, but depending for steady progress upon the spirit and power which is constantly renewed in the furnace of the heart. And as the ship from year to year is improved in its model and appliances, so the progressive mind receives new inspiration, and its passage is made quicker, happier, and safer by a larger knowledge and improved helps. There is but one worship there, and that, the soul's deep sense of need and gratitude, the conscious communion with the Father, in spirit and in truth. Words, symbols, music, are the Spirit's tools, essential and useful only as they serve to build the soul more stately mansions. To your final question, was Jesus God or man? What think ye of Christ? I answer, I do not think, I know. As the Egyptian in his reverence spoke not the name of Osiris lest his name be lightly breathed on earth, so, dear friend, do I falter as I try to speak of him who in the providence of God was the highest and purest revelation of a spiritual soul. Above the dim mists of superstition and materialism towers this majestic, colossal figure, mantled in holiness, his face all aglow with conscious, intimate communion with the Father, the ideal sanctified soul. One with the Father, because filled with the Holy Spirit, the Son, because living in the Spirit, in harmony with the divine will, he hath left us an example that we should follow in his steps. Consider the beautiful spirituality with which he entered the future life, and then, if imagination does not fail you, conceive of a progress of 19 centuries from that starting point. Yet is he our elder brother and our friend, and enthroned in the loving, grateful hearts of all who have been led by him into a higher life, he lives and works with that great company of holy souls, to lead humanity onward and upward into the perfect light. It were impossible, with our finite minds and limited powers of comparison outside, or rather inside, the physical, to conceive of the possibilities of progress there. Suffice it for me to say, that having seen such ineffable glory, I know that farther heights are beyond our present comprehension. Merciful it is, that they are veiled from our sight until we grow strong and pure enough to bear them.